And the other day, someone came to visit, and in the course of the conversation, they asked, well, what is it that I must do? And it was responded to them, your only task and practice is to listen. Just a few days ago, there was occasion to ring the RACQ because the car wouldn't start. But when calling up the call station, it was found out that it had lapsed in January. So our membership had lapsed in January. So a conversation of sorts ensued. But every time there was an attempt to ascertain what it is that was needed to be done or to explain something, the person on the other end would just butt in and with some other kind of information. So the conversation became very convoluted and very long. But fortunately, it was necessary to hang up and go and get some documentation and the credit card so that action could be taken. And when ringing up the next time, very fortunately, there was another person on the other end of the telephone who was able to listen, and so there was very concise instructions about what should be done. So it was paid and it was fixed, and the man came and so forth. But it reminded me of a story, and that story is about this goat herder. And every day he would take his goats up to the pasture on a hillside for them to feed. But it so happened that this goat herder was completely deaf. But it didn't bother him, because his days were spent on the side of the hill taking care of his goats and seeing the sun move across the horizon. But then one day when he was up sitting and the sun was rising at its zenith in the skies, of course it came to that noontime where he would usually partake of the little box of lunch that his wife would prepare for him. But as the hunger pangs were gathering and he felt around, it was found that his wife had forgotten to give him his lunch box or his flask of water. So he was thirsty and hungry. And he thought to himself, well, I cannot stay here for the rest of the day without drinking and without eating. And with that, he espied a man gathering grass further up on the top of the hill. So he thought to himself, oh, I'll just go and ask him, would he mind taking care of my goats while I go down and get my lunch from my wife? So when he approached the man who was a farmer gathering grass for his animals, it so happened that this farmer was totally deaf too. So the goat herder said to the farmer, look, my wife has omitted to give me my lunch basket, and I just want to take a few moments to go down and get something to drink and something to eat. Would you look after my goats for me while I'm... What are you talking about, said the farmer. No, you cannot have any of my grass. I had taken me all morning to gather this grass for my animals, and no, you cannot have any of it at all. Oh, and the goat herder was nodding and saying, oh, thank you very much, I won't be very long, I'll just go down and get my lunch and my water. So the goat herder went off back down, and when he got down there he found that his wife was quite ill, and he had to go to his neighbor's house to get someone to come and take care of her. But he got his bread and his cheese and his flask of water together, and he went back, and he approached his herd, and he counted them all, and they were all there. So he was very grateful. So he went further up the hill to where the farmer was still gathering, and he said, "Oh, thank you very much, but before doing so, the goat herder thought to himself, well, he took good care of my goats, and I've got this little lame goat here. It'll make a good meal for the farmer for this evening." So he picked up the little goat and he carried it up to the farmer, and he said, "Oh, thank you very much for taking good care of my goats, and here is a gift for you to say thank you." "I don't know what happened to your goat. How do I know what happened to your goat?" And a great altercation ensued. There was argument back and forth about what was going on, and it got a little bit heated and loud. And just at that moment, a man came riding along on a horse, a passerby, and they thought, well, they'll intercede with the rider and see if he could clarify the situation. But the rider happened to be totally deaf too. So when he got down from his horse and the goat herder was trying to explain, he said, "Well, I tried to give him this goat that I'm saying thank you," and the farmer saying, "No, he can't have any of my grass, and I didn't do anything to his goat." And the man who got down off his horse said, "Well, yes, I did steal a horse, but I didn't know it belonged to you, and I'm really sorry." And so they were all having this great altercation about what was going on, and it got louder and louder and louder. And it so happened that there was an old dervish wandering along the road. So they decided that they would approach him to see if he could intercede again and clarify the whole situation. But it so happened that this dervish was completely dumb. He couldn't speak at all. So here's the goat herder trying to explain, and then there's the farmer trying to explain, and then there's the horse thief trying to explain. So they're all... So the dervish, listening with great acuity to each one of their tirades, looked into the eyes of each in turn with his black, piercing gaze. And when he looked first at the goat herder was so intimidated and so afraid that he very quickly gathered his little flock of goats and went off towards his house. And then, of course, the farmer, who was gesticulating, in the middle of his gesticulating, when the piercing gaze of the dervish looked at him, he too was totally intimidated and afraid, and quickly bundled up his hay and his grass and put it on his back and hastened up the hill to his farm. And the same thing with the horse thief. As soon as the piercing gaze of the dervish looked into his eyes, he thought he was going to get the evil eye, and he quickly jumped on the horse and rode away. And the old dervish walked down the road, shaking his head, having a thought. What do you think that thought of that old dervish would be?
I should have grabbed the goat and got on the horse.
The power of speech is lost in human kind.
Exactly, that's exactly what he said. Exactly what he said. The power of speech is lost on mankind. So what does it make us realize about this? What is the difference between that speech and hearing, or even hearing and listening? What is it that comes up for us as a realization in this exchange of language that we have in life? First of all, we know it's linear. Like our thoughts, all language is linear. It goes in a straight line, one word after the other. But what about hearing and listening? First of all, what's the difference between hearing and listening? And what is it that happens when we really listen? Listen with, because listening takes all of our being. It's reflected in our body stance when we really listen. There's a relaxation, there's an opening, even our hands tend to open in the act of listening, doesn't it? We find ourselves totally open. So what's the difference between this linear and this? Because, no, I'm not going to say so. What is it?
We take in the vibrations behind the speech.
Yes.
And not so much the words.
Absolutely we do. We do. That's the outcome of it, isn't it? But what is it that happens in the act of listening, besides it being reflected in our body language, that openness?
We receive.
Yes, we receive. That's what follows. But what is it about this act of listening? What's behind our body language when we actively listen?
We're not speaking.
Yes, there's nothing linear there at all. Is there? Nothing linear.
No, we create space. We
Absolutely.
open up
And that space is endless, isn't it? It has no boundaries at all. So if this act of listening has no boundaries, and in it there's a state of receptivity and openness, it's a natural progression for us then to move behind that and recognize our own non-beingness, because in that state we're in a state of non-being, isn't it? And what does that non-being connote? There's no self present. There's just the openness of receptivity and listening.
It reminds me of what I was saying about how emotion comes up too, because when we just allow and even just listen to ourselves, or that maintaining that presence, we can see, observe or be aware of the chatter in our head and,
Absolutely.
and the feeling in our
Absolutely.
body, and so we become just totally present.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
And we can actually, things can then, from that stillness, can
Yes.
can come.
Yes, yes. But the difference between hearing and listening. When we're hearing, like we would say to someone, I hear what you're saying. What are we really meaning by that? And what's the difference between that and saying, I'm listening to you?
We're not always open when we're hearing.
That's right. We're not always open when we're hearing, because we're hearing with our mind, isn't it? But when we say, I'm listening to you, there's a total difference, isn't there? So there's a difference between the act of hearing and the act of listening. And we can catch ourselves, because we do find ourselves saying that. Yes, I'm hearing what you're saying, isn't it? Then saying, yes, I'm listening to you. Thank you. And there was nothing wrong with the car.